Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Aquarium's Online Academy. My name is Kaya, and I'm coming to you live from the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California. And I'm super excited because this morning we get to talk about who eats who in the ocean, or in other words, food webs in the ocean. And we're going to be talking about animals in a particular habitat. And if you have any questions while you're watching, or you'd like to share any of your observations while you're watching, I would love your participation. Please feel free to text us live at 562-286-1838. Or if you're watching this later and you still have questions for us, we'd still love to hear from you. You're welcome to email us at live@lbaop.org, and we will get back to you. Just make sure that you check with a parent for permission before texting in. Data rates do apply. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started thinking about who eats who, or food webs in the ocean. So does anybody have any ideas about what a food web might be? Some of you might be familiar with the term food chain, which is what a lot of us tend to think of. So when we think of a food chain, that usually means looking at a few simple animals and how they relate to one another. But a food web really encapsulates all of the animals and their relationships in a particular habitat. Now, is anyone familiar with that term, a habitat? Let's break that down a little bit. So if I were to show a picture of a fish for you, maybe we can throw up a picture. I'm not alone in the studio, by the way. I have Alicia, who's controlling all the things behind me. Thank you. This is perfect. And then we also have Allie, who's taking any questions that you have. All right, so here's a fish. Now, where do you think this fish lives? Now, the first thing that might come to mind is it lives in the ocean, right? And this fish does live in the ocean. This is a Garibaldi, our state fish. But the ocean is a really, really big place. And there's lots of different areas in the ocean that are different from one another. And that's what we consider habitats. So habitats are particular areas where animals and other living organisms live. And in the ocean, there's so many different habitats that we can talk about. We can talk about coral reefs. We could talk about the deep ocean. We could talk about the open ocean. Things like whales and big sharks live there. Or the habitat that we're going to be focusing on today is called a kelp forest, which is a very unique habitat off of our coast here in California. And this is another look at what a kelp forest looks like. So this is one of our exhibits here. And why don't we just start by making some observations? What do you notice? What can we find in a kelp forest? Oh, my favorite animal is swimming by right here. That is a leopard shark. What else do you guys see? So I'm noticing there's lots of different rocks and sort of, rocks and maybe like cliffs here. And then I'm seeing this, which is, of course, our kelp. Do you guys notice that as well? Let's talk a little bit about what kelp is. Is anybody familiar with that term? Who's heard of kelp or knows what that means? So there's another image I'd like to take a look at. Perfect. So here's an example of kelp, a kelp forest off of our coast. And what do you see here? So the first thing that I'm noticing, and there's tons of sunlight coming through our kelp forest. So I'm actually going to start there, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what kelp is. Because the beginning of any food web and any habitat is going to be the sun. That is what really drives all life on this planet. So let's take a look at our camera so that we can start recording some of these ideas over here. So I have this special whiteboard over here to record things. So the habitat that we're talking about is the kelp forest. And the beginning of any food web, whether in the ocean or on land, is the sun. Now, does anything eat the sun? How is the sun the beginning of our food web? I said we were talking about who eats who, right? Well, let's think about this a little bit. Who eats the sun? Well, not exactly eating the sun, but plants and algae do what we call photosynthesis. They are able to make their own food using sunlight. So in the case of our kelp forest, the kelp is photosynthesizing. Now, if you look at this kelp, what does it look like to you? I think it kind of looks like a plant. Do you see that? So this is a lot of times when people look at this, they think it is a plant, but this is actually a type of algae. This is a giant algae, actually. And it is very similar to plants in that it photosynthesizes, and they have some structures that look very similar to our plants that we find on land, but they're even simpler than plants. And we can talk a little bit about the different parts of a kelp and how they work. So one thing that I notice when I look at this is how big this kelp is. Do you guys see that? Like it is really, really, really tall, sort of reaching up to the sun. And that's because this is a very fast growing type of algae. It can grow up to 2 feet a day, which is that's a lot, right? And can grow very, very fast if we think about it. And that's also why if we look up top here, we can see it's sort of all grouped together. And that's because it sort of folds over once it reaches the top and creates a canopy. So the kelp forest is an incredibly important habitat off of our coast here because there's not very many places in the world where kelp can grow. So we're unique in that way. And because it grows off of our coast, this provides a really important area for lots of animals in the open ocean. So out in the open ocean, there can be tons of currents that are rushing by, and the kelp forest stops those currents. It creates a very calm environment. So a number of fish and other animals like invertebrates and mammals are able to sort of utilize this area as their habitat. So very important for the animals that are out there. And they are able to use the entire all of the parts of a kelp or a kelp forest. So it's not just in the middle, but some animals spend a lot of time up top in the canopy and some spend time way down at the bottom. And I'm going to take a moment to show you what that looks like. So I talked about how these look a lot like plants, right? So if you think about what a plant does, how does a plant grow? What does it put into the ground to help it stabilize? They use their roots. Now, kelp has a different structure very similar to roots called a holdfast. And I'm actually going to show you what that looks like under the camera. Oh, I see Pam was thinking along the same lines. Pam just asked, do kelp have roots? And they don't have roots. They have what's instead called a holdfast. So let me show you what that looks like under our camera here. Beautiful. So if you were to just look at this, you might think, that these are roots because they look very similar. We see it's very dense. There's a lot of them. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. But you can see there's lots and lots of little spaces here. So what they use their holdfasts to do, I'm going to stand here so you can get a sense of, so I can show you. See all these little holes, all these little areas that lots and lots of little animals like crabs might spend time in. So lots of tiny things are able to use the holdfast of kelp as their habitat. Now, the kelp holdfast hold onto rocks. So if you remember that one exhibit we took a look at, I pointed out there were lots of rocks in there. So kelp use their holdfast to hold on to those rocks and then are able to grow up towards the sun. So that's what so here we can see again, lots of rocks. Kelp are able to hold on using their holdfast and then extend up. So the entire part of the kelp is incredibly important for habitats, or as a habitat for the animals that live there. Okay, so we have our kelp, and they are photosynthesizing. So they are what we would consider the producers in our kelp forest habitat. And I want to also point out that they are not only important for the animals out there, but they're important to us too. Because one thing that happens when plants photosynthesize is they produce oxygen. Who needs oxygen? Well, all of us do. If you guys taking a deep breath with me, that is because that we have plants and algae out in the ocean producing that oxygen. So kelp and phytoplankton produce up to 50% of all of the oxygen that we breathe. Here's a great picture of some phytoplankton, which are these tiny little microorganisms that live out in the ocean. And this is actually really the base of the food web for the entire ocean. So all of the animals out there, they wouldn't exist if there wasn't any plankton out in the ocean at all. So we can see, what do you guys notice here? What colors do you see? So we see green, right? Just like plants on land. And that's because they're also photosynthesizing. So that's one way that I know when I look at this picture, I'm looking at phytoplankton. Now, there are two types of plankton. So this is phytoplankton, like plants. It's a plant-like plankton. There is also zooplankton out there, and those are animal-like plankton, which actually eat phytoplankton just like this. So I can show you an example of some zooplankton under our microscope as well, actually, since I'm talking about it. Nope, scratch that. I don't have an example of that, but we might be able to show you. Oh, here's an example of zooplankton. So these are jellies, right? Now, when we think of plankton, we typically think of really small microscopic things, but jellies are another example of plankton because the definition of plankton is something that can't move or swim against the current. So jellies, although it does look like they can swim, I think Alicia's going to pull up an image of them swimming or moving, they actually aren't strong enough to move against the current. So here's our moon jellies that we have here at the aquarium. And we can see that they're just sort of drifting along. So they're not able to move against the current. They can undulate their bells. So that's this part that you see here. They can pull water in and push it out. So it might look like they're swimming, but they are not actually strong swimmers at all. And oh, here we go. Here's krill. This is what I was thinking of. Or copepod, excuse me. So if anybody has seen SpongeBob, you might be familiar with the plankton in that. And that is a copepod. So this is a type of zooplankton, and they eat things like the phytoplankton that we saw earlier. So they are tiny creatures, but very important for the food web across all of the ocean. Okay, so back to our kelp forest. So we talked about the kelp and how important it is for that habitat, how it's really the basis of that habitat. Now, who lives in the kelp forest? Who eats the kelp? That's the next type of animal we're going to talk about. So I'm thinking of an animal that loves to eat kelp, but it might be an animal that you are not familiar with. Let's throw a picture up of our sea urchins. Is anybody familiar with this animal? If you visited us, you might have had a chance to touch them, or if you live in California, maybe you've gone to a tide pool and seen some urchins. They also can be found there. And what do you guys notice about this animal? What does it have all over its body? So I see lots and lots of spikes all over it. Any ideas why it might have that? So those are going to help it stay safe from its predator. That's its defense mechanism. To keep itself safe from the animals that want to eat it, which we'll talk about it in a moment. But you can see, what is it on? It's on kelp, its favorite food in a kelp forest. So they only eat algae or algae matter, so they are considered herbivores because they don't eat any other animals. They only eat plants or plant-like things like algae. A lot of times here at the aquarium, I get the question, well, where is its mouth? You know, they're concerned about where it is. And its mouth is underneath its body here. And they have a really unique mouth to help it eat all of the algae and kelp in the kelp forest. Oh, here's a good picture of it. So it's right here. And if we were to, I think, zoom in even closer, or if it were to open up, we would see they have what we call an Aristotle's lantern mouth, which is a very fancy way of describing its mouth, but essentially they have these 5 sort of teeth-like parts that come down. It looks almost like I don't even know, like they have fangs or something all around the circle, all around their mouth. And that's to help them scrape. So they'll spend a lot of time in the kelp forest scraping algae off of rocks. And then if they're able to, they'll also eat the kelp blades that fall down. So kelp blades will fall down to the bottom of the kelp forest, and they'll eat those as well. So these urchins love to eat all of the kelp, and so we can see it here munching on a blade of kelp, which again looks a lot like a leaf of a plant, but is a little bit different. It's not as complex as the leaf of a plant. So these urchins, again, are called herbivores. And I'm going to add them to our little drawing so that we can keep track of who's living in the kelp forest and what eats what. Oops, I also have to add our kelp. Okay, so I'm going to do a little rudimentary sort of kelp. So my kelp is not nearly as big as the kelp that we saw on screen, but hopefully you get the idea. Kelp. And again, these are called producers because they produce their own food using the sun. And who eats the kelp? One animal is our urchins. Ooh, I don't even know if I want to try and draw it. But there we go. It's like a little spiky ball. But there are other things in a kelp forest that eat the kelp. Let me zoom out so we can get a better look at our food web. So if we were doing just a food chain class, then I would probably just stop here and say this is, a nice little chain of relationships in the kelp forest. But we're talking about a food web and looking at the relationships between all of the animals that live in this habitat. So I'm going to focus on one other herbivore in here that eats the kelp that you may or may not have heard of, but you might have seen their shells before because they have these really beautiful shells. Do you guys see an animal in here? I think they look like they're camouflaging. They're blending in really well. Oh, but I think I see the body of something right here. So these are called abalone. Have you heard of abalone before? So these are a type of sea snail, believe it or not. And they are local, again, to our coast here. And they're found all up and down the coast of California. And unfortunately, right now, a number of them are endangered because of overfishing. It's one of the projects that we are working on here at the aquarium. But they are another herbivore that's found in the kelp forest, and they also eat kelp or other algae that they find in on rocks, on the surface of rocks. So just like that urchin will sort of scrape food up, they also will sort of slowly move along these rocks and eat whatever they find. And I'm going to also show you what their shells look like because that might be a little bit more familiar to you. So we're going to switch over to our document camera and take a quick look. So this is an abalone shell. So like we saw in the picture, this is the top of it. And a lot of times they'll have algae actually growing all over their shells. And then when you look inside, you can see that beautiful iridescent color that you might be familiar with. So again, they are another herbivore found in the kelp forest. They also love to eat kelp. There's our little abalone. There's its little body. And they actually have very cute faces. There we go. Okay, so these are our herbivores. Oh, I see. Okay, I'll have to zoom out a little bit. And another way of thinking about them is they are consumers because they are consuming the kelp. Okay, so I see a couple questions have come in, so I will answer those before taking a look at some other animals that we have living in the kelp forest, like who eats the abalone and the urchin? So you can think about that. Who might eat those? Who are our carnivores that live in the kelp forest? So Delilah is asking, do sea urchins have eyes? And that's a really great question. Do they have eyes? Do you see any eyes on them? So I I don't see any eyes, but I do see something else covering their body. Do you see, besides the spikes? Do you have an idea of what I'm talking about? These things right here. All of these little sort of tendrils coming out of them. And these are their tube feet. So they don't have eyes, but instead they use this structure on their body to sense things as they're moving throughout the ocean or moving around. So they don't have eyes in the same way that we do, but they still are able to sense things all around them. So they use these instead to help with that. Great question. I get that question a lot about them, but there's a lot of animals out there that don't have eyes. And Gabby is asking, when the sea urchin eats, does it eat the whole leaf or blade, as we would call it when looking at the kelp instead of a leaf? That's a really great question. And they can eat the entire thing if they're really, really hungry. So these are hungry little urchins, and they will eat whatever they can. In fact, they can actually be a huge problem to kelp forests if there are too many of them, because they will eat a whole lot of the kelp. And so that is why this next animal that I'm going to be talking about is so important to the food web of the kelp forest habitat, because without this predator, the entire ecosystem or habitat food web can fall apart. They are what's called a keystone species. So does anybody know what animal I'm talking about? What animal might like to eat the abalone and the urchins? It's one of our cutest animals here at the aquarium, I think. We can put a picture of it up. A sea otter! Were you guys thinking of this animal? Oh, and we can even see it having a little snack here. So, sea otters are not only really cute looking animals, but they are incredibly important for the health of the food web of a kelp forest. So here's a great picture of them eating, having a little snack. So it's not an urchin here. That is a crab, but it gives us an idea of how they eat. So let's talk about this. How are they able to eat these animals that live either in like sort of that have a hard outside? Like our urchins are covered in those spines. The abalone has that really hard shell. Crabs also have a very hard exoskeleton. But otters are able to eat them without a problem at all. So they have a number of adaptations that allow them to hunt all of these animals. So let's talk about them. Well, first of all, what's it doing here? How is it eating this crab? It's holding it, right? So their paws are actually very dexterous. They're able to use them kind of like we use our hands. So they spend, oh, here we go. We can see it eating in action. See how it holds it up to its mouth. They're able to catch their food here at the aquarium. Ugh, I could watch this video all day. Okay, so in the wild, what do they do? So if you noticed, where was it in our in those videos? It was up at the top, right? So they spend a lot of time, they live in the canopy of the kelp forest. So they'll wrap themselves up in the canopy, they'll wrap their young up there, and they spend a lot of time on their backs. And so what they do is they will dive down to the bottom of the kelp forest, where a lot of those invertebrates or other animals that we mentioned live, like the urchins and the abalone, and they'll pick them up in their little paws and bring them back up to the surface. And a lot of times they'll bring a rock with them. They have a little pocket under their arm that they can put the rock in, and they use that to crack open these shells or the hard exoskeletons of those animals, and they're able to eat them that way. Now, the reason that they are so important is because they eat a lot of these animals. They are even hungrier than the urchins. So it is typically pretty cold where we find kelp forests. It's about 60 degrees, maybe even less. And so they have a very thick layer of fur. They do not have blubber to keep them warm. And in order to keep up their body heat, they have to eat about 25% of their body weight every single day. My friends, that is a lot of urchins and abalone that they have to eat throughout the day. But by doing this, by eating all of these, herbivores that we find in the kelp forest, they keep those numbers low. They keep those numbers at a very, they keep those numbers down so that the urchins and abalone don't overeat the kelp. So So what we saw happen in our kelp forest is we saw a huge loss in our otter numbers because of overhunting for their fur. And with the loss of our otters, we started to see the kelp forest die out because there weren't otters to regulate the urchin populations. So that's why we consider otters a keystone species. Okay, see a few more questions come in. So Noah, hi Noah, is asking, how do sea otters not get stung by spiky animals? So the urchins that we find in our kelp forest, they don't sting. And those spikes, they look really intimidating and like they're really sharp, but they're actually kind of like toothpicks. If you were to touch them, they're not as spiky as they look. And so otters are sort of able to get around those spikes and just pick them up in their little paws. Good question, Noah. Lots of people wonder about that. And Chaz is asking, what other carnivores are in the kelp forest? And that's a great question, Chaz, because again, we are talking about food webs, and otters are not the only predators or carnivores that we find in a kelp forest. There are definitely a few others, and in thinking about all of these relationships, I think it's important to bring those up as well. Oh, okay. Am I blocking it? Oh, I see another favorite carnivore or predator in our kelp forest. Can you guys see it? It is hiding right now a little bit. It's poking out its head. Oh, right here. Do you guys see our eel? Ooh. So this is a moire eel, which is another carnivore that we find in the kelp forest. Perfect. I'm going to go on this side over here. So eels are another carnivore again, and they spend a lot of time sort of hiding in the rocks, kind of like we just saw in our webcam, and then they will reach out and strike their prey as they swim by. And eels have a lot of incredible adaptations to help them do this. They have what we call a pharyngeal jaw, which is another set of teeth in their throats. Okay, so imagine this: a fish is swimming by, they lunge out, grab it with their normal jaws, and then a second set comes up and holds their prey in place, and then they're able to swallow it. So eels, another predator in the kelp forest that are pretty amazing animals. So they aren't exactly eating the same things that our otters are. So otters, because they have to eat so much, they tend not to eat things that are really fast, that swim, like fish, because that's a lot of energy to have to chase after them. So they spend more, that's why they eat things that are, slow moving, like our urchins, our abalone, clams would be another example of something they eat. But eels, they eat things that swim by. They're opportunistic hunters or ambush predators, so they really will strike out at things that swim by. And there are a number of fish that live in the kelp forest. I haven't talked too much about them, but just by taking a look in here, what do you guys see swimming around? Fish, right? So there's a few different types of fish that we find here. I was hoping our sardines would swim by because that would be an example of an omnivore that we can find in the kelp forest. They're a schooling fish, but there are other fish that live in our kelp forest. So here's one. These are our rockfish, I believe. And then we also have our Garibaldi. So we looked at that picture of it at the start of this program. So they're another carnivore that lives in the kelp forest, but they eat slightly smaller things than our eel would eat. Oh, and another carnivore, again, my favorite, that is a leopard shark. And this shark, again, would eat smaller fish that live in the kelp forest. So lots of examples of different carnivores that live here. Another carnivore I'm thinking of that maybe we can take a look at and end on could either be our sheep's head or our giant sea bass. I think we have some pictures of those. So look at this fish. This is a huge fish that can be found in the kelp forest. These are called giant sea bass, and they have been known to get up to 500 pounds, which is a big, big fish. And they have another unique mouth that allows them to eat their prey. Oh, here we go. Here we can see ours swimming here. We can get a sense of their size. You guys might also notice their patterns. They have really unique sort of spots all over them. Here's one coming up. We can see that big mouth. So if I was a little fish, I would be pretty nervous right now. So what they do is they'll open up their mouth and it's almost like a vacuum and they sort of gulp their food whole. Oh, and we also can see the eel coming out to say hi. I guess all the carnivores are coming out in the kelp forest right now. Pretty amazing. Okay, so that actually is just about all the time that we have today. Um, but we got to cover a lot. Oh, there we go. There's our eel swimming by. But we got to cover lots of different animals. I'm actually going to wrap up. I'll draw the last things that we talked about so we can have a complete sort of food web before I sign off. So what eats our urchins and abalone? And I'll draw sort of just a really quick fish in here as well. This would be our otters and urchins maybe. We talked about giant sea bass, which our fish would be eaten by. And then our moire eels. Okay, so looking at this, we can see that a food web is really more complex than just a chain of food relationships in a given habitat. So, and all of these animals are really important for maintaining the health of the overall habitat. I hope you enjoyed talking about these different animals and learning a little bit more about our kelp forest, our local ecosystem here off of our coast here in California. We do have more programming the rest of the day, and I hope you will tune in for that. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.